This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 85. Government Debt and All That.
Hello, welcome again to the Debunking Economics Podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie, and today, government debt and all that. One of the biggest problems with Boris Johnson's push for more money for the NHS is that he's saying the money's being freed up by the reduction in money we're going to be paying to the EU. But as we explore again, governments don't have to balance budgets like households. If we want more money for the NHS, we should just get the Bank of England to create it. That's all. So Boris Johnson wants an extra £100 million to be spent on the NHS, a little less than was promised on the side of the Brexit bus. But his argument is that people need to see the material benefit of leaving the EU. And that is that there is more government money to spend on services like the NHS, money that we are currently paying to the EU. But does it actually work like that? On the podcast, we've talked about a lot in the past how the government can create money through their central bank, in the UK's case, through the Bank of England. The only constraining factor is if they create too much money, we get inflation. And I'm pleased to say my 11-year-old son can explain the relationship between the amount of money in circulation and the rate of inflation pretty well. So he sort of gets it. But most people don't understand that money can be created. We still hear the media talking about how governments need to live within their means. Austerity is important because we've got to get the budget back on track. And Boris is saying, yes, we can spend more on the NHS because we will be saving on what we pay to the EU. The same problem. So as a rule, we don't get the idea that governments can create money, although many do understand that central banks buy bonds with money that are created. That's quantitative easing. That's the way it works. And we've seen a lot of that lately. The US Federal Reserve has bought trillions of bonds, trillions of dollars spent on bonds. The Bank of England has created hundreds of billions of pounds to buy bonds. So from that point of view, money creation is accepted, so it's sort of part of conventional wisdom these days. So, Steve, it seems there is a bit of an understanding that money can be created to get us out of trouble.
Well, only a bit of an understanding, and the panic level stuff about the government having to live within its means. It was used so effectively by the Tories to win the last election and to win the 2010 one as well, the 2010 and 2015 elections. They can't trumpet that as triumphantly as they used to because all sorts of stuff-ups have occurred afterwards. But that's still basically the argument that they have, that if the government doesn't run within its means, we're accumulating this huge debt that future generations have to pay, and we've got to be careful about those dear poor future generations. So rather than building hospitals and schools and railways that they can be born in, be educated in, and be transported in, rather than doing that, we'll make sure we don't build those things so that they don't have any financial debt to pay back to us in the future.
Yeah, and yet at the same time, though, we're saying, we understand central banks buy bonds with money that they've created, and we all become familiar with the idea of quantitative easing. So central banks can create money. The US Federal Reserve, of course, has bought trillions on bonds. The Bank of England's, hundreds of billions. So from that point of view, money creation is accepted. It's seen as being unconventional by conventional economists, but it's there and it's understood, and it's almost becoming conventional wisdom, isn't it?
Well, and only to some extent, because people haven't really joined all the dots together, and this is what I'm trying to help people do with my Minsky software. And I might whack a little, if we actually with the podcast, if we can whack a little model up and say, please download the software and run this, you'll see what I'm talking about. Yeah. They've got to join the dots together, and they think, okay, QE's occurred, that's huge, and oh dear, that's been unfair for, a massive increase in inequality, but the economy seems to have benefited out of it. And, but at the same time, thinking, the government can run out of money. The government can, the austerity stuff is nowhere near as strong as it was before we actually tasted austerity. It's one of these things where the advertised taste is not quite so good as the actual. One of my favorite little jokes on that front, let's get a joke into the podcast here. Bill Gates dies and gets to heaven, and St. Peter says, oh, well, if somebody as important as you actually get a choice. You can choose between heaven or hell. And somebody invented Microsoft Windows. You've got to get the choice. And he gets taken on a tour.
I think you should go to hell just for that, to be honest with you.
Hang on a second. He goes on a tour, exactly. He goes on a tour of heaven, and there's these people sitting around, floating on clouds, playing harps and contemplating and being very meditative. And he goes down to hell, and there are these wild parties with sexy women everywhere, and wine and women and rapacious behavior occurring. It looks fabulous. He says, I'll choose hell. And he gets to hell and finds himself on a rack, having his flesh stripped off and reattached and stripped off again, and acid poured all over him. And he says, "What the hell? What about the advertisement?" And he said, "Oh, that was the advertisement in the pre-release version, not the actual thing."
Right. I have no idea how that has anything to do with what we were saying before.
It did sort of.
But we were talking about how bonds are created and how people.
Well, is people not connecting the dots.
Yeah.
And the taste and the argument about austerity being good for you, being rather different to actually experiencing austerity in the flesh. And that's what's actually happened. People have got to say, well, austerity will mean the government's got, the government can save for a rainy day, so we'll have cash available when a crisis occurs, to fixing it up after the crisis. You've got to repair the roof while the sun is shining. Those sorts of little analogies being used all the way through. Then people experience it and they find actually what we do is we don't even build the roof in the first place.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's what's actually happened with austerity, and that's why they're not selling it as well, but people still haven't connected the dots that maybe austerity is not a good idea, maybe it's an extremely bad idea.
Well, the dots I'm trying to join is the dots between us going through a period of austerity at the same time that the central bank is creating money.
Yeah, that's right.
Why is the money that's created not being used to remove that need for austerity? Why isn't it being used on things that the government can invest in? So if they're buying government bonds, why aren't those bonds being used to employ people, to create infrastructure, to improve our standard of living?
Yeah, and also that really comes back to the other point. Why isn't central bank money creation capacity being used to do those things as well? Because what's being pointed out by QE, and this is why I say people haven't joined the dots themselves yet, is that nobody's received a tax bill for QE. Now, in the UK's case, QE was £200 billion a year for quite a while. £200 billion is, virtually the scale of government spending itself. It's in the same ballpark. And you got a bill to pay for tax purposes for government spending, allegedly, but you didn't receive a bill for QE. Now, why is that? Well, it's because both of them can be funded just by the government's money creation capability. And that still hasn't dropped in people's heads yet. And it's still this, like, as soon as you're saying anything about government money creation, you say, yeah, but what about Zimbabwe? Okay? Or what about Weimar Republic? Now it's what about Venezuela? And instantly the fear, the bogeyman that this is going to lead to runaway inflation becomes the dominant message.
Yeah.
Now,
clearly it hasn't. But isn't the reason why we're not seeing it and on our tax bill is because the way it's issued. So the central bank creates money to pay for bonds, to pay for government bonds that it buys. So the government is basically saying we need more cash for whatever it might be. We're going to issue bonds. The central bank buys those bonds, and then at some point they wind back on buying those bonds. They sell them to somebody else. So in effect, that's how it becomes an off-budget item, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's possible for the central bank simply to say it wants to buy £1 billion worth of bonds off a private financial institution. It simply enters that much money in the deposit account that financial institution has at the Bank of England, and then records the transfer of the bonds of a precisely equivalent value on its asset side. So its assets rise and its liabilities rise, and there's absolutely no limit to the capacity of central banks to do that. And that's something you can find economic radicals like Alan Greenspan and Ben Bernanke saying before the crisis hit, that they've got a limitless capacity to do that. The reason it's limitless for the central banks, whereas it's not limitless for private banks, is that central banks don't have to have positive equity. And you'll find a recent Bank of England paper in Bank Underground saying precisely that. So they can they can just do as much as they like because they have the backing of the state in that sense to mean where that state operates in the United States of America or the UK or in any country you care to name that issues its own currency, it has an unlimited capacity to create that money without needing to worry about whether it puts it into negative equity or not. Now, a private bank doing the same thing will fold if its assets collapse in value, because when it drives up, it creates money by lending, so-called, and then the assets rise with the debt that it's generated, and the liabilities rise with the money it's created. When they then end up buying private sector assets, which they frequently do, they buy shares and bonds and other companies and so on. If you have a stock market crash going on, then the value of the shares can plunge very rapidly, and with very little time, you can go from where it's assets minus liabilities is greater than zero, so the bank is solvent, to assets minus liabilities is less than zero, because when the assets fall in value, the liabilities don't change. It's taken out of the bank equity, and it can fold.
So no such problem for central banks, of course, because
exactly they don't even if it did happen to them, if they bought masses of shares, and they've virtually done that with QE, they've come close to buying shares. And there's been some forms of QE they are actually buying shares, I believe. They don't need to worry about that. So they don't have those limits the private sector has. And that's why when you look at it, you say, well, why, if you don't have any limits, why do you apply those limits to financing government spending at the same time?
Yeah, and yet it's not used for financing government spending, is it? That's the thing. When a central bank buys bonds, when it buys government bonds, it's not because they're saying, well, okay, let's help governments create more bonds so that they have more money to spend to create better projects. They're actually doing it because they want to basically reduce interest rates so that the private sector can borrow more, or people are going to buy other bonds in the private sector rather than government bonds, in the hope that that's going to create more jobs and lead to growth. So they're seeing it as a step in the process for boosting the private sector rather than just a direct measure to put some money into the government's pockets.
Yeah, and the thing is they can do both. There's no reason why they can only do one of them. So the ideology, and this is where ideology is driving what's happening in economic management rather than a genuine, hard-nosed analysis of how financial flows work in a capitalist economy. The ideology says it should all be private sector. All these economists, I must say central bank economists have changed radically after the financial crisis, at least in the UK, and to some extent the European banks have changed in their attitudes, having experienced how their ideology stuffs up the economy. But the ideology is, well, it should all be private, and these people on government back in 2000 and up to 2007, these economists paid by the public purse, working in the public sector, were dedicated to the elimination of the public sector as we know it. Their argument was it should all be private. That was the overall thrust of the form of economics they learnt. So they were quite happy to use a money creation capability to drive interest rates down when they thought that was necessary, or drive them up and maintain a target interest rate, which is part of the economic models they use. It's the so-called dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, include the central bank manipulating the interest rate to control the rate of economic growth and the rate of inflation. They're quite happy to do that, but at the same time, they thought they shouldn't fund any government spending whatsoever. And the government was completely absent from their models in the sense the fiscal balance was not seen as having any role in the economy. So it's, and now, of course, what they've seen the consequences of that now to some extent, because this is supposed to give you a perfectly functioning private system, and bang, we had the financial crisis. So after that experience, they're a bit more realistic in central banks.
When governments do issue bonds, I mean, they do tend to expect it's for a project that's going to have payback at some point, don't they? So, for example, it's not going to happen in this case, but the Australian government with the NBN, which was a large project, the bonds were issued for that. As I understand, that's how that was financed, because they expected it was going to pay back ultimately, and presumably that happens all the time. But what about operational expenses like paying teachers and nurses and the police, the stuff that appears on budgets, in the government budget? I mean, is there any reason why that couldn't follow the same process? Just issue bonds for the money that's going to pay those salaries?
Well, that is what we used to do, and we're forced into doing it, because ideology is one thing, putting ideology in practice in the real world is another. And if you look at the American economy, the ideology has been, if you go right back to the 1920s, you can find the same arguments. Government should run a balanced budget in the long term. Well, I think I'd be willing to regard 120 years as long, wouldn't you, roughly?
Yeah.
How about 117? Would you do me a deal on 117? Is that a long term?
So the
long-term average for the government surplus in the United States is minus 2.3% of GDP. When you take out the Second World War, it's minus 2.2% of GDP. So over the long term, history has shown that the government runs a deficit. It spends more than it takes back in taxation.
Yeah.
And this
Pretty much the situation in England, of course, since the
it's global. It's global.
Yeah.
And the reason is because if you're in an economy which is growing, there's never been an economy, a capitalist economy on the planet that has grown for a sustained period in real terms, in terms of the goods and services we consume, without a growing money supply at the same time. Now, the money supply is created in three ways. You run a trade surplus. We can strike that one out for both the UK and since the 1970s, the USA. The banks lend more than they get back in repayments, which creates money, but creates an identical amount of a debt for the private sector. There's no increase in the net equity of the private sector out of borrowing money from private banks. Or the government spends more than it gets back in taxation. Now, that's the only way that you actually get an increase in the net equity of the private sector. And if you therefore have a growing economy and the private sector is trying to acquire an increase in its net equity, the fact that taxation is levied on the basis of income and government expenditure is levied on the basis of the lack of income, what you get over the long term with a growing economy is a tendency for the amount of money created by the government to grow at the rate of GDP divided by the velocity of money. Now, if you've got an economy which is growing in nominal terms at about 5% per year, and that's roughly what the American economy has grown at for the last 117 years. And the velocity of money is round about 2, which is what it used to, is now actually plunging down towards 1, but historically it's been between 2.5 and 1.5. Lo and behold, the government is going to spend about 2% more than it gets back in taxes. So the practical reality, the actual historical experience of the American economy, which despite its current problems, we have to accept as the most powerful economy on the planet, has been that it's run a deficit.
Yeah.
Okay. We've got the wrong terminology. I still haven't come up with a decent word, but it's effectively a government deficit of government money creation for the use by the private sector. So that's what it is.
So, of course, if you run a deficit, the way accounting practices deal with it at the moment, if you run a deficit, then that deficit just increases. If you have deficit one year and then you have add to that the next year, then you're just adding to the level of government debt that you hold. So I think you're saying, well, that shouldn't be an issue. We should just the central bank should issue that money. But in effect, you're not building up this massive level of debt. It's just operations as normal. But what would be the accounting practice of that? Because you don't want to have a look and see your government debt is just increasing every year, and we've just accepted it because it's going to reach a phenomenal level.
You can recall it equity,
right?
You could call it equity,
yeah,
because the government doesn't have to pay back bonds that its own bonds. It's people think about selling bonds and they go overseas, and you've got to pay the money overseas. If the UK was issuing bonds in American dollars, then that would be a real problem. So countries that are forced to do that, like Argentina, like Venezuela, like Zimbabwe, they need to bring in massive imports compared to their exports, because what's actually caused their collapse often is a domestic destruction of productive capability by bad government policy domestically. They've got to import goods which are produced overseas. People want American dollars for it. They issue bills, they issue debt in American dollars, and the currency plunges. That's the negative cycle everybody's talking about. But if you have an economy which is a strong Western economy whose debt's accepted, then you'll have Chinese buyers buying bonds which return them British pounds from the British government. And the British government can't run out of pounds to pay that debt back.
Right. So why is that happening then? Because if we look at the national debt, it's costing the UK government £46 billion a year. So they could just create that money. That's what they do. But they are borrowing from other people as well. So only about a quarter of that £46 billion is money from the Bank of England. The rest is pension funds, private investors, foreign investors. Why would the government do that if they could just borrow it all from the Bank of England and just deal in sterling?
Partly, well, they could actually do it all with their internal money creation capability, but it's partly ideology tied up in that, and it's also partly an income distribution system. If you think about, we go back to the 19th centuries, we're all used to the Charlotte Brontes, the novels of Charlotte Bronte and the wealthy back then would talk about their wealth being stored in government bonds, because if you go back to that period, I think in the Napoleonic period, I think government debt with that stage was about 350% of GDP. Of course, that meant that England could not become an empire, which of course it bloody well did. So what was happening is people would have government bonds as a form of income coming out, which the bonds would be paying them income issued by the state, and that people were quite comfortable about that. There weren't novels of Charlotte Bronte talking about we're all going to be ruined, and think about the terrible debt we're leaving behind for our future generations, which of course was almost zero.
Yeah. So I mean, should we just do away with government bonds then, or should we just say, well, that's fine so long as you want to pay for them in sterling, because we're only ever going to pay the money back to you. We're only going to pay your dividends in sterling, and that's easy for us because we just print the money.
Well, that's what actually happens. And like one of the reasons that corporations will buy private bonds, even with government bonds, even with extremely low yields, is because they get involved in open market operations with the bank. There's buying and selling of the bonds. And there's capital gain to be made in those buying and selling. And you've got to have the bonds to be in that particular game.
Right. So
in some ways, it's the biggest game in financial town.
So that $46 billion a year that the government is paying, we shouldn't worry about it, because if they're paying the Bank of England, who cares? Because the Bank of England just plows that money back in anyway. If they're paying private investors, those private investors will be expected to be paid back in sterling, their dividends, or when they cash in the bond. That's still going to be in sterling. So again, they can just print the money to satisfy them. It's just the foreign investors, but foreign investors presumably would be buying those bonds in sterling anyway, and would be expected.
That's you got a choice. You can buy British bonds in pounds, or you can not buy British bonds.
Yeah.
And the same thing for the USA and so on. And people always talk about the bond vigilantes, and this is one term I actually like, a term invented by Paul Krugman. The argument at some stage the bond market's going to rebel and not buy the government bonds. When you're talking countries like America, the USA, Canada, Australia, South Korea, et cetera, there have always been, if not just fully subscribed, massively oversubscribed. There's more demand to buy the bonds that are in fact issued by the government. So and we've had again, this is what I'm saying. Let's look at 100 years of history. Has this happened in the past? No. Then why should it happen in the future when we haven't had a substantial change in the circumstances? It's still central banks being able to create money. It's still the government money being used for financial transactions within its own realm. All these things mean the problems about running out of money are impossible, and the problems about bond vigilantes are also simply do not occur, because the private financial institutions need those bonds for their own financial operations.
Right. So when we hear this, and it is a very emotive figure, isn't it? When you hear, well, the government is paying £46 billion a year just to cover the cost of its debt, we should just say, well, who cares? They're just going to print the money. Why does it matter?
Yeah, and what we're doing is we're imagining our own situation. So we're told the government's doing this. We think, if I was in that situation, what would I be doing? Well, if I had that amount of debt to pay, I would not be investing in the kids' education. I would not be buying that new car. I would not be buying those shares. So we think the consequences of that for the government are the same as it would be for us, which is mean we can't invest in the future for our children. Now, ironically, what we end up doing is saying, let's not build schools and hospitals and railways and universities and institutes of higher education and so on. Let's not build these. Otherwise, kids will have debt. So we're promising our children effectively a financial future free from financial obligations and also free from any of the infrastructure that makes an economy worth living in.
So should we worry then if that $46 billion that it's costing us to service that national debt, if that becomes $90 billion and then it becomes $180 billion and then it becomes $300 billion? I mean, at what point do we say enough is enough? I mean, it is just an accounting figure, but if your total budget is a certain amount and your debt level is, say, 4 times that, then things look a bit out of balance, don't they? So there's got to be, surely it means the accounting system is wrong.
Well, in a sense, the accounting system showing that as debt rather than equity is wrong.
Right.
Yeah. But if you look at the scale of government debt in the UK, I mean, it's been as high as 350% of GDP. And that was back in the golden days when you actually had an empire. So historically, you look at it and say, well, if they didn't panic then, why are we panicking now? What's changed? And what's changed is not the practical circumstances, it's the ideology.
But isn't the reason that figure is rising as well is because this money is being paid through the issuing of bonds, and therefore you have an interest payment that you've got to make. You've got a dividend that you've got to pay on those bonds to try and encourage investors. if you didn't issue it all in bonds, I mean, can you just say to the central bank, hey, we need more money, transfer it from your bank account to ours, thanks very much?
Effectively, you can. And then in that sense, the debt is all an internal accounting operation between the Treasury and the Bank of England or the Federal Reserve. So it can all be done in internal accounting.
But that doesn't happen, though. That never happens.
Well, it used to.
Right.
It was feasible, but we've put political and legal limits and saying you can't do that. So what they say is the central bank can't be the initial buyer of bonds issued by the Treasury. Now, therefore, what happens to have, first of all, the Treasury bonds have to be bought by the private sector. And then once that's done, the central bank can buy those bonds off the private sector. It's a roundabout way of achieving exactly the same outcome.
Right, except for the fact that in that outcome you are issuing bonds, and therefore you've got to be making payments. You've got to make interest payments on those bonds. Whereas if it was just a straight transfer of money, you don't have that. So you're not adding to that national debt.
Well, in fact, when you do the accounting, and as I've done this for a submission to the Parliamentary Treasury Committee recently, when you do the accounting on the government actually buying, the central bank buying the bonds directly off Treasury and having an interest rate, that interest rate actually increases the equity of the central bank.
So why, when it's so easy for all of this to happen, why did, under James Callaghan in the 1970s, why did the UK government have to go to the IMF for a bailout then? With the IMF then saying, you're going to have to cut government spending if we're going to bail you out. Why would they just not say, well, that doesn't matter. We'll just create money to get us out of this hole?
It was back in the days of the fixed exchange rate.
Right.
And with the fixed exchange rate, you could run out of American dollars. When you run out of American dollars, you can't get involved in international trade. Therefore, you've got to issue bonds denominated in American dollars to be able to go into national trade again. And that's where you got into the clutches of the IMF.
Right. So that couldn't happen again.
Not with floating exchange rates. I mean, I'm a favourite. Pardon me, I'm having a bit of breakfast here. Pardon me.
No. For the last half an hour, you've been eating your breakfast. We've been enjoying it. We've gone from the cup of coffee through to the bacon and eggs.
No, it's actually pancakes. But
right, okay, cool.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's the fixed exchange rate were the reason why you had to go to the IMF, because you ran out of American dollars because you're running a trade deficit. Now, the response should be, well, let's stop running a trade deficit. Let's try to find a way to either boost British industry so we don't have a trade deficit anymore and impose international rules that prevent economies running gigantic surpluses, because in that particular case, if Germany is running a 10% of GDP surplus, then the rest of the world is running a 10% of GDP deficit, Germany's GDP, with Germany. And what's happening in that situation is that effectively Germany is outsourcing money creation. The rest of the world is creating, in those days, marks for the German economy to spend. And this is what leads to the type of massive financial imbalances we have right now. So that should have been the correct response of saying, let's go back to the policies which, in fact, Keynes put forward back in the Bretton Woods period, which was to have an international currency not created by a national economy like the Americans, but created by the IMF as a global central bank. Fixed exchange rates at the same time, so you could run out of Bancor and so on. You'd be forced to devalue, but you wouldn't have to bring in something as draconian as the IMF loan terms, which were imposed on the UK and actually legitimised a lot of the chaos we're in today.
Because the pound went down a great deal when all of that was happening, and often the value of a currency is related to the level of government deficit. I guess because traders get spooked by governments supposedly running their budgets into the red. So I mean, I guess is that the only reason why that relationship exists, and because people assume the government can run out of money, and if that's the case. From what you're saying, there should be no relationship, surely, should there, between the value of the...
Well, there's almost no relationship empirically. The only reason that happened back in those days and Soros made a killing was because of the fixed exchange rate. You were running out of American dollars because with the fixed exchange rate, if you're running a deficit, more American dollars are going overseas than come back in, so the reserves are falling. You can look at that and say, well, there's no way that you can sustain this valuation of the pound, therefore it has to fall. Therefore, I'm going to be a radical young trader, as Soros was then, and short the pound, and I'm going to borrow enormous amounts of money to do that. So I might be putting down £100 million out of my company's own account, but I'm going to buy £10 billion worth of pounds. And if I'm going to short that much, and if the value falls, I make an enormous profit, which is what actually happened. So the fixed exchange rate, when you had a set of national currencies running, and you didn't have all the the checks and balances that were built onto the Bancor idea by Keynes, that can lead to the catastrophe that hit Britain back in those days.
So central banks are now, of course, saying, well, look, we're going to back out of our bond buying program. They were extraordinary measures for extraordinary times. All of a sudden, we're returning to normal, or the new normal, the normal way of doing business. We're going to get out of buying government bonds. We're going to let private investors buy those bonds instead, and everything's going to be fine. I mean, does that matter too much? I guess because if the government issues bonds, there's always going to be a buyer for it. Doesn't matter from the discussion we've been having today whether it's actually the central bank that's buying those bonds or private investors, because the dividend, someone's got to pay the dividend to the private investors. It's going to be the central bank anyway through the government.
Yeah, largely. I mean, it's when you do the accounting properly and look at what actually happens when the government issues bonds and they're bought by the private sector funding a deficit, then in fact what's going on is that there's actually a transfer of money from the financial sector of the economy to the real economy, because that government deficit means the government issues bonds. The bonds are then sold to the private financial sector. The money that was used to buy that by the financial sector ends up back on the government's books, and the government then spends that money into the real economy. If you go the opposite direction and trying to run a surplus, you're taking money out of the real economy and put it into the financial sector. Now, people should ask themselves, which part of the world needs more money right now, the real economy or the financial sector?
Oh, that's a difficult one, Steve.
I know.
Yeah. There are some people in the financial sector who are struggling, aren't they? They can barely manage to afford their Coke habit.
That next 160-foot yacht's going to have to be cut back by 2 inches.
So what's the simplest way of doing this then? Is it to say, within maybe you set bounds on this, but you say that the government can in effect run a deficit, because that is that should be accepted as the norm, and the central bank provide some sort of accounting process to transfer that money without necessarily issuing bonds, just basically like a straight bank transfer into the government's coffers. Is that the easiest way of doing it?
Or declaring what we call debt as actually equity,
right?
Because it's a measure of the amount of money created by the government for the use by the private sector in the economy. So yeah, it's just getting over our heads that there's no problem for a government spending more than it gets back in taxation. In fact, that's necessary to create part of the money supply that we rest of us use in the private sector. Is
it equity though? If it's money that's transferred and it's used to create an asset like a new motorway or whatever, I could see that's the case. But if it's money which is put into government coffers that then goes into a nurse's pay packet, is it equity as such?
Well, think about it. You're thinking about the actual financial financial instrument being issued by the government. The moment we call it government debt, we could call it government equity or equity in the UK. That'd be a good title for a punk rock band, wouldn't it?
It would. Too late for that, I suspect.
Yeah.
In terms of time and your age, I suspect. But who knows?
Equity, it starts as anarchy in the UK, ends up as equity in the UK.
That's right.
But if you don't issue that money, then you don't build the bridges, you don't build the hospitals, you don't build the schools, et cetera, and you suddenly have a impoverished third world economy, which has got great financial accounts.
Right.
Not exactly what you're trying to achieve. So this is the great fallacy of it, and it's just money creation by the government. Fundamentally, that's what's going on.
And it becomes another instrument as well, doesn't it, for the central bank? I guess they can say, well, okay, we do have to keep the and I hate this expression, keep the government honest, because you'd hope that with their elected representatives, you'd hope they would be honest, but they do need to make sure that we don't have runaway inflation. If they created extraordinary amounts of money, then that could happen. So they need to make sure that they don't create too much for that to happen.
It's one possibility. What is actually more likely to happen if you do that, you're going to have a trade deficit coming out. The main thing I'd like to have governments focusing upon is not their own deficit, but the trade deficit, current account deficit. That's the one which is most damaging in the long term.
Right. And
also the level of private sector leverage. Those are the things to look at. The government, in that sense, the government, whether it's running a surplus or a deficit, is an instrument rather than a target. It's something you use to manipulate the rest of the economy in the areas which are worrying, which include private sector indebtedness and having a current account deficit. It's not a target in its own right.
But they could fix that if they had the money to fix it, of course. So you can export more if you can make more, which means you need investment in factories and businesses and infrastructure to make that possible. Yeah,
and this is one of the, again, when I'm trying to get the accounting sensibilities through to people, because if we're all trying to achieve positive net equity, and that's, we most of us would love to have our assets minus our liabilities being positive. When you actually look at that at the aggregate level, that's not possible out of if you have a fixed amount of money in circulation and one group tries to acquire more by saving more, that actually reduces total income by precisely as much as saving has actually occurred and doesn't increase aggregate equity. If you borrow from the banks, you get an increase in your money supply, but you also have a matching increase in your debt, so there's no change in your net equity. The one way that the private sector can, all of the people in the private sector can have assets minus liabilities being greater than zero is if the government has assets minus liabilities being less than zero. Now, the government's got a capability to get away with that because it owns its own bank. The rest of us don't have that capability. So if we say the government's got to act to the rules we think apply to us, the actual result of that is it backfires and means we all end up with negative equity.
Yeah, and that the way you've just explained it makes perfect sense. And for those people who have difficulty with that and always have to look at the the housekeeping analogy and applying that to government, I guess the easiest way to say to do that, to provide that analogy, is to say, well, in your household budget, maybe you get a child allowance from the government, and that's money that you've got from not doing anything apart from the fact that you've got children in the house. That's an injection into your bank account. Could be the same. The government's basically getting a government keeping allowance from the central bank, and they balance their books after they've got that injection from the central bank.
I'll have to work on that analogy a bit myself, mate. But
it's just a way of simplifying it, isn't it? It's like, you're trying to balance how much you're spending, but there's a slug of money coming from somewhere else. It's coming from the government. For the government, it's coming from the central bank.
Yeah, and the government, this is the modern monetary theory people have been trying to get this through, I think, just some success, but not enough to get through the political debate, is that if the government runs a deficit, that is precisely equal to the surplus in the private sector. So if you've got a private sector trying to have assets minus liabilities being greater than zero, so you've acquired net equity, that can only happen if the government's doing the opposite direction, because your asset is somebody else's liability. And therefore your equity, if you're in positive equity in the overall economy, somebody else will be in negative equity, and the government's the only institution that can manage to run negative equity permanently because A, it owns its own bank, and B, that bank can be in negative equity with absolutely no consequences.
Right. So let's let them do it and not argue against them doing it, which is what's happening right now. Okay, very good. Makes perfect sense. Good to talk. We'll catch you again soon, Steve.
I'll finish my breakfast by then, mate, I promise.
I should think so. So rude, isn't it? Now, look, next time, rebuilding economic theory the old way. The Oxford Review of Economic Policy in its latest journal has developed the entire addition to the idea of rebuilding macroeconomic theory, but unfortunately, they're using the same old names with the same old thinking. So what are they missing out on? We'll look at that next time on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Thanks for listening today. We'll catch you again soon.